Yeah, thank you for coming to this week's episode of the Social Housing Roundtable. My name is Matthew Baird. Anybody who has been on these before will know that I run a recruitment company that specialises in social housing. I've been doing that for 11 years. I set up on my own 18 months ago, 2 years ago, with the idea of trying to do something different. And something different is the roundtables and what we're doing here. And so very happy this week to bring Laura Bryan to the roundtable. So Laura, do you want to quickly kind of introduce yourself and I guess why you brought the topic to the table this week?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for having me. So yes, my name's Laura. I'm a nutritional therapist. I'm a mindset coach, and my business is called Mind Nourishing. And basically, I specialise in supporting individuals and businesses to kind of improve the productivity, energy, and mood of their workforce or the communities through the power of food. So basically, like, I know it's a bit of a kind of a niche area because I specialize in housing. So I thought it's probably helpful to kind of give you a bit of an intro about why am I working in housing? That's all a bit random. So I used to work in a housing association in South Wales. And it was during that time that I'd already done like an undergrad in exercise, nutrition and health. And I was like really interested in well-being. So I was actually working out in the communities to get families more active, which was a funded project that we were running through the Housing Association. And it was the coolest job ever. Like, it was really, really fun. And I was basically supporting mums to get more active, buying them trainers so that they could go to the gym, or supporting them to take their kids to swimming lessons and those kind of things. And what I quickly recognised and was actually quite shocked about was that the communities that I was working with were obviously quite deprived, and the families had very severe mental health issues. I was kind of trying to put on these sessions, but families were unable to leave the house, or it might have been that kids had really severe kind of ADHD and were struggling to actually engage in the activities that we were organising and kind of paying for them to go to. And at the same time, because we were talking a little bit about nutrition, I was starting to get more of an idea about what these families were eating. And it was very heavily processed vegetables pretty much once a week and Sunday dinner. And I knew, for me, I knew that when my previous, before going to uni, when I used to think that food was just calories and I didn't have a very healthy relationship with food, I remember that I used to feel I had no energy, mood was low. But then when I learned how to fuel myself properly, I felt really good. And I knew there must have been a link between how these, obviously other things play into it, but I knew there must be a link between food intake and mental well-being within the communities. So I went back to uni, did a master's in nutritional therapy, and really dived into the research between our gut and our brain and how the foods we eat can impact our mental well-being. So a lot of the work that I do now is actually working with housing associations and their workforce. Initially, I did do more within the communities, but for me, it's I'm kind of, the approach that I'm going in is that I really want to support people who work in housing initially. As someone who used to work there, I know that it's quite a stressful place to be. You're kind of working with very vulnerable people, and burnout, especially at the moment, is kind of like through the roof. Like, people aren't managing the amount of pressure they're under. So I now work in these organisations, support the workforce to raise their awareness around food and mood, have practical tools to be able to change their habits, what they do. And the intention for this is that we know that there's often a ripple effect. And my intention is that by supporting the workforce and kind of getting housing associations to invest in their work, their kind of employees, that then they are better equipped to work with the most vulnerable within our community. So that's the process that I'm currently under through Mind Nourishing.
And how's it been going? Because you talk about it as if it's quite, I know obviously you've mentioned your master thing, like it's a new venture, but it's not as if you're not working with some big players out there. I mean, we were talking before, and Notting Hill Genesis and Curo and others out there. There's some big businesses that are really kind of embracing what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, so it's probably been the last year and a half, 2 years that I've focused purely on housing. And I think what's probably in my advantage is that maybe a couple of you have joined today. When I send out that initial email, people are a little bit like, oh, that's a bit weird. Like, why is someone contacting me about like how my kind of colleagues eat and how that impacts their mood? So I'm quite lucky in the fact that it sparks conversations, and I'm really hoping that in today's sessions we can kind of talk about this a little bit more and talk about the importance of food and how we can start bringing some of these habits into our own lives and into the lives of the kind of our workplaces. But yeah, like I'm finding I'm doing a lot of kind of awareness sessions with a variety of different organizations. So currently, well, I've been working with about 15 to 20, got a few more organizations over the next few months that I'm going to be working with. And it's quite nice that once we do an initial awareness session around how food affects your mood, there's often like the conversation wants to continue. It's not like people then start changing their habits and conversations start going in the workplace, and people are talking about what they're snacking on or whether they're taking a break at lunchtime and moving away from their screen. So it then equips itself nicely for follow-up sessions and group coaching and resources. So yeah, some organizations are embracing it, which is quite nice to see.
It's brilliant, and it's certainly, as I say, whenever the roundtable comes up, there's people always kind of go, "Oh, what topics are you coming up? Surely just recycling old things?" I'm saying, well, no, there's so much that we talk about, and nutrition is absolutely key. If anyone, by the way, at any point wants to come in, please feel free to raise a hand. I'd love to have you join the conversation, or alternatively just put something in the chat box. If unfortunately, like Claire, maybe not feeling quite so well today, if there are any questions or anything, please feel free to use that and utilize that service. I guess when we were first talking about this, there were two areas that came to my mind, and I appreciate there's much more that goes into it than that, but the two, I guess, key things for me were, it was the differentiation between staff. So on one side of it, we have perhaps trades operatives or people who are out and about on the road all of the time, and are having to just, I know, dive into Greggs or dive into wherever to get something. And then you've also got your office-based staff where sweets on the table, cake sales, those kind of things have become very commonplace. So where I guess do you start in terms of that support journey? What are the things that people need to kind of realize, I guess, from mental side? Because I know we've talked a bit about that link between kind of gut and mental health as well.
Yeah. So it's quite interesting in terms of often when I'm chatting with housing associations, and I don't know whether anyone else in the room kind of has this same challenge if you're working in HR or anything like that, there often is a struggle to engage with those who are out of the office, and trade staff who are kind of out on the road, who maybe can't come and attend sessions, or maybe are less likely to want to engage. Unfortunately, often that can be a real struggle. So the approach in terms of how we deliver can be very different, whether it's that we actually go to those members of staff and put on a kind of a toolbox talk in their like weekly meeting and put on a little bit of like food, create discussions around nutrition. But I think generally, I guess if we take a little bit of a step back, because it might be that some of you here today is thinking, well, actually, Laura, like, I'm not really sure why we are talking about this. This is really random. I want to just give you a quick recap or a quick introduction, maybe, in terms of like why I talk to trade staff and people in the office. And obviously, it's because we know that mental health issues are like really high at the moment, and that is one of the main causes for staff sickness. And obviously, within our communities, we know that mental health issues is like it is the pandemic of the moment. So we know that there is a direct link between our gut and our brain. So we have this amazing community within our guts called our gut microbiome, and that is filled with trillions of different bacteria, viruses, funguses. And we know that these bacteria are really involved with our immune system. So 70% of our immune system is within our gut, but they're also involved with creating neurotransmitters like serotonin. So 90% of that is in the gut. It's involved with these bacteria involved with dopamine, that like rewards, like motivation feeling, and also GABA, that lovely calm feeling, is created in the gut. And our gut is connected by a vagus nerve, and our gut is very chatty. So 80% of the messages throughout that nerve are going from our gut to our brain. So there's been loads of research recently, like, and every day I'm kind of getting updates of the research, but we know that how our gut environment is made up is really impacting how we feel. And individuals, for example, who are depressed will have a less diverse gut bacteria than those who are happy, feeling good, and thriving. So the way we can use food is that we can quite literally modify that environment of our gut so that the messages coming to our brain are a much healthier, happier kind of messages. So that's the kind of quick science behind it.
I had no idea that 90% of serotonin was in the gut.
Yeah,
that's just like, in terms of the mindset, that's not the kind of thing you're taught.
Definitely. And there's this new concept now that our gut is our second brain. And there's a lot of information about how these bacteria create our personality and our traits and even what foods we crave. So we're actually made up of more bacteria cells than human cells. So they're a big deal. And we want to be making sure we have this opportunity when we're at work and every time we eat to change that gut environment. So I think that's why I wanted to bring this topic to the table. It's because people often don't realize how important that snack at work or the dinner with your family, how important that actually is for how you mentally feel in the next few days, because this gut environment is changing all the time. And it's actually quite, well, I hope you find it quite motivating that it's that we like that quick gratification of like, we can change things quite instantly. And with food, we actually can create those changes, which is really important.
So and I'm not going to kind of go, oh, snacky foods and that kind of stuff are all bad or whatever else, but where are we going wrong from a housing side? You know, there's a lot of roles which are at the desk and then a lot of roles which are out and about. And where are people kind of going, this is, obviously you mentioned there about talk, is it that it's, do we need superfoods? Do we need, what is it we need to be looking at?
Yeah, well, I think it's, if we're looking at kind of people working in housing, I guess, and it's the same with quite a lot of office-based individuals. But I know from my experience, I think when people are tired because they're working stressful jobs and they may be having to skip lunch because maybe they're having to see a client or someone calls up and about a housing emergency or whatever it is, we tend to then seek dopamine boosting foods, the foods that are going to make us feel good. And that often is the leftover birthday cake from yesterday that someone brought in, or someone maybe brings in the kind of tub of biscuits to try and raise the morale of the team. And there's always these lovely intentions that people have around food. But it's really difficult because it kind of counteracts what we know about the gut environment and how that can actually make a shift in a negative way to our gut and create imbalanced blood sugar levels that can create anxiety. And I think it's that kind of trying to break the cycle of how we usually do things in the workplace so that we're supporting more energy and not kind of fueling kind of a more tired, more anxious workforce. Claire, I know you've got your hand up. I've just spotted your comment as well.
Yes, you mentioned there about the Bromford Stone, because all the cakes, etc. And do you find it funny? I used to have exactly the same one when I worked for an old recruitment company, which you'd have at the time it was the Venn Group, so it was the Venn Group Stone. But everyone talks about it wherever you go to. It's this: as soon as you start a new business, you'll put the stone on because we're in an office and that's what we do. But Yeah, Claire, I know you're not feeling a
And,
1,000,000%, but thank you. Please do
and we
come
joke
in.
about it. Yeah, we joke about it as if it's funny, and it's not funny really. I just wanted to ask you about how, well, there's no easy answer, but how do we get away from that being the treat? How do we get away from cakes being the answer to everything, like you say, the biscuits to raise morale? And I just wanted to mention Matt and I co-hosted a supporting colleagues through menopause discussion a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember now. And that was one of the things that we talked about, that if we are encouraging everyone to have cakes as a treat, then that's really negative on people who are experiencing perimenopause and menopause symptoms. And, you know, can we try and turn that round into more positive treats? Have you got any tips on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the magic answer, Claire. I wish I did. I'd be very rich if I knew the answer. But what I do think is always important is that initial awareness, because when we do these habits, and I see this with my one-on-one clients all the time, it's just what you do, and there's no kind of conscious thought to it. It's like, yeah, I'll go in, I'll have a biscuit and I'll have a cup of tea, or yeah, I'll always buy cakes for my team, and it's that's just the usual habit. I think where I benefit, and where I most see kind of housing associations benefit, is when you start breaking down that automatic habit by bringing in a little bit of awareness. So that's why I always really like to start with like an awareness session that introduces the link between high sugar foods and how that can create anxiety, and how we know that will cause later on in the day you to have sugar dips, and for you to then crave more sugar, and then that cycle kind of continues. And I'm not saying that awareness and education is always the kind of the thing to change everything, because we know from a lot of health promotion campaigns that just by literally telling someone to do something won't change things. But I have found that people love to talk about food, and I think that sometimes helps to engage with people from trade backgrounds and other backgrounds who don't usually kind of engage with wellbeing initiatives, because we all eat multiple times a day. We're all pretty nosy, so we all kind of like to have a little snoop at what everyone else has got in their lunchbox, or what they're having from the kind of shop round the corner. And I think after people get that education, the conversation generally continues within the workplace. And I think when it comes to the habits in terms of buying cakes and things like that, obviously it's not just one individual that's buying them all the time. It's that kind of culture of the organization that's normally the norm of what it does. So it's not going to be an overnight switch, but I feel like with the initial awareness sessions, and maybe a kind of a communal agreement within a particular team, or hopefully a number of teams, to say, yes, we enjoy these things, and actually nutrition is all about enjoyment, and I'm definitely an advocate of not cutting out things that you love. Like a life without cake would be horrific. So it's not about completely taking these away, but maybe it's about the intention that actually, if I'm having these foods multiple times a week, am I actually really getting all of the enjoyment that I want from them? I often find that when we reduce the amount of times we have them, and then go into that cake eating time with a real intention to say, oh my goodness, this is a real kind of different routine for me, and I'm going to sit down with my colleagues, and we're going to eat this cake, and we're going to chat, and we're going to laugh about what we saw on TV last night, and create a really lovely environment that we can actually feel really good, rather than it being a 3 times a week thing that we grab a piece, go to our desk, continue writing our emails whilst we're eating it, not really mindfully, not noticing it. And I think if we kind of create those conversations with teams that have that intention, that whenever we do this, it's going to be a real kind of lovely and fulfilling and wholesome environment, then I hope that would be the catalyst to kind of change some of the culture. But I don't know whether, like, is that something you feel is realistic, Claire, where you work?
Well, I work alone, so.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So it just makes me feel more lonely.
I do as well. We can still enjoy cake, don't worry.
But no, I love that message to make it more of a mindful and experience. I think as well that we demonize. No, we don't demonize the. Sorry, so many lemsips. We put on a pedestal, don't we, the cakes, and say, oh no, I'm not going to have cakes. I'm being really good, and I'm denying myself. I'm only having fruit. But actually, a really nice fruit platter or a smoothie can be amazing as well.
Yeah, and
Whereas
I think
we say, oh no, they're terrible. They're, I'm denying myself, and I'm only having fruit. And that's not helpful.
100%. Yeah, it comes back to mindset quite a lot, which is why, as a mindset coach as well, I always like to kind of integrate some of those things. But I think you've made a good point there about kind of fruit platters, because I think it's another not a barrier, but a thing that I see quite a lot in housing is that it has to be an organizational shift sometimes when we talk about changing that culture of well-being, because what I sometimes find is that companies might invest in how food affects your mood or eating for energy awareness session, and then 2 days later at a staff conference it's very beige, the buffet, and the messages are very haphazard. So I like your kind of observation there around what we want to try and do is start thinking about all of our messages to the workforce, or whether we're working in the community, that we're kind of setting an example and taking that lead and showing our colleagues, everyone we work with, that actually it doesn't have to be that eating healthily is restrictive and boring. It can, we want to try and create that excitement as much as we can, don't we? So yeah, I really, really like that point.
I know a couple of businesses, both in recruitment and housing, that are a number of years ago had the traditional tuck box. That's what we had, and have changed that to a fruit bowl. And on one side of it, like, that was brilliant to see. But then if that wasn't always engaged with, fruit would go mouldy, people aren't eating it, and the entire initiative would just stop. And so it's keeping that. I agree with you. I think it's that momentum that's very difficult. We've had a message there from Rosie in the chat saying, absolutely brilliant topic. My problem is being in a rush and end up buying snacks from the shop, both unhealthy and expensive. Any ideas for simple snacks and meals we can take to work? I just watched some really interesting info on food and lowering cortisol, the stress hormone, and this really reiterated how important it is to eat well.
100%. Yeah. So actually, I was before this session this morning, I was recording a podcast for a housing association that's going to be played out to trade staff as a different way of trying to engage. And the topic I did around that was kind of choosing your snacks whilst you're on the road. So yeah, Rosie, it's such an interesting topic, because obviously it's the availability is maybe less if you're on the road, because it's normally smaller shops and things like that. And also we, again, creatures of habit, will tend to always get the same things. And normally it would be something that quick energy, like chocolate or sweets or something to get your blood sugar levels up quickly. So as a bit of an insight, some of the things that I mentioned on that podcast, first of all, was again that education piece. So I did a little bit about how you can use the packet just to quickly find out how much sugar is in each option, because obviously there's loads of things that make up food, but quite often of the time, and many of us eat too much sugar, and that can impact that stress response that you've mentioned, because if our blood sugar levels peak really high when we have these rich sugary foods, they then dip because we release insulin, and it's at that point where we dip that our stress response is triggered, And it's a survival thing because we don't want our blood sugar levels to be low. So we become a little bit stressed. Some people feel a bit anxious, and then we crave something sugary because we need our blood sugar levels to go up, and the cycle continues. So one of the tips was around looking at the labels, and specifically looking at the sugar per 100 grams, because it just makes it easier to maybe compare two different things if you are unable to decide. But ideally what we want to be looking at is if it's under 10 grams of sugar per 100 grams, that's pretty good, it's pretty okay. But ideally if it's under 5 grams per 100 grams, that's classed as a low sugar snack. But normally I'm very much all about kind of adding in rather than taking away, because I think when you start saying to people about you've got to cut out sugar, or you can't eat that, or you can't eat that, I know I'm definitely someone who doesn't like to be kind of restricted, so I switch off completely. So I'm very much about looking to add in. So when we're looking at snacks, we ideally want to be adding in protein. That's because protein doesn't impact our blood sugar levels. It keeps us nice and steady, and prevents those sugar dips, mood dips that we can get. So snacks, high protein snacks, could be something like mixed nuts. It could be, obviously this would take a little bit of pre-planning, although some shops do it, but things like boiled eggs, or kind of hummus is often something that you can get in shops now as well. But generally, or protein balls. I know some of them can be expensive, but Aldi and Lidl now actually do really cheap options with those kind of things. They're often quite well now, actually. They're often by the till rather than kind of like sugary, more sugary snacks. So yeah, and then the final thing would always be like something with fiber in it as well. Because, I mentioned about our gut bacteria initially. That bacteria's food is fiber. So if we're able to kind of fuel ourselves with fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, these are the kind of things that feed our gut, and then our gut then helps us with energy and supporting our mood.
I didn't realize nuts were quite so good for you.
Yeah, definitely. And this is the thing, people originally, because we know that they're high in fat, people are like scared off them, and I think there's been previous
pub snack, you know what I mean? That's what you have in the pub. Like,
well, yeah, definitely. And obviously, like, there's going to be a difference between the roasted and salted versions and things like that. But still, if you're kind of opting and you're thinking, all right, am I going to have a packet of crisps, which nutritionally is void, or a packet of salted nuts, which is going to, at least, yes, it's still going to give us some less helpful vegetable oils and salt, but generally at least it's got the protein and the fiber. But I get it, Claire. Yeah, so fruit just feels more difficult than reaching for a biscuit. And I'm totally with you. Like, if I was offered an apple or a biscuit, of course, like, our human brain is programmed to seek out pleasure. Like, that's what our ancestors would have wanted, the highest kind of energy food. So how I try and kind of counteract this, and maybe how we can use this practically in housing, and whether you're working at home or in the office or remotely, is that we are creatures of our environment. So it might be that initially, whilst we're changing our habits, we have to proactively change what's in our environment. Because if there is always a biscuit tin at the end of our desk in the office, of course, like, often we think it's willpower, but food is more than that, because it is actually that it's programmed into our survival instinct. So willpower will completely go out of the window, which is why I never want people to feel guilty when they do have too many biscuits, because it's quite literally your primal instinct to seek that out, and we haven't adjusted to the availability around us. So what I would say is that maybe it's about creating that intention to yourself of what's going to be around you. So if you are working from home, can you, like Rosie's just put, can you maybe pre-prepare and make some really nice kind of banana bread or something that you know exactly is in it? Or is it that actually you're going to keep that fruit bowl on your desk rather than your packet of biscuits? Or if you're working out on the road, is it that you're going to put a bag of mixed nuts in the van rather than kind of relying on a packet of Haribo? And obviously this is all very basic, and I don't want to come across as preachy, but like these are maybe some things that you can do in your environment, because initially we need that pre-planning, and then science has now shown that the kind of reaction that we get in our brain when we eat something sugary is actually, or kind of like a processed sugar, is actually no different than that reward feeling that we can often get from things like nature's treats. So things like berries or kind of like honey or nuts. Like our brain doesn't kind of fire differently. So with a little bit of training, we can actually get that same amount of pleasure that we can get from processed foods that we can get from nature's treats. But obviously, initially, we need to change our environment so that we opt for those foods and get into the habit of having those.
Rosie had asked her, what's your view on dried fruit?
Yeah, so dried fruit, like I think, well, can be part of a really healthy, balanced meal. What I would say is that obviously with dried fruit, we're sucking out all the water, which does then mean that it's very condensed sugar. So as you can imagine, for example, we would struggle to eat, say, 5 plums because there's a lot of water, there's a lot of fiber in there, and we'd fill up quite quickly. Whereas it would be really, really easy to eat. Wait, what's dried plums? Is that prunes?
Dates.
I always get.
Is it dates or prunes? I can't remember which.
No, I think dates is a separate. It might be prunes, but I'm going to be the worst nutritionist now. But the equivalent of a dried plum. Obviously, with that, it's very easy to eat more because it's taken the water out. So I would definitely say it's great. It can be added in, but you just need to be a little bit mindful of portion sizes. And I would always say with fruit, always and especially dried fruit, again, just add a bit of protein in there so you don't get that sugar dip after.
The protein part's really, really interesting. And I know I think there's so much that goes into this topic today. And evidently, I want to make sure we're giving people, and as we're already doing, giving people some real kind of things to take away from it today. I actually made my first ever cake of the weekend. It was my girlfriend's 30th. And I hated every minute of it. Don't like baking. I like cooking. No. Definitely enjoy baking. But I knew. But the advantage was I knew what was in it. And so again, it's that it's finding that kind of balance between actually, at least I know what's in my food, which is something really mentioned. Now, there were a couple of questions that had come through before we started today. Some people who couldn't attend. One of them was evidently this whole piece is around kind of health, well-being. And for a lot of housing providers, it's something which they are focusing on. Is there a danger which kind of going, okay, we're going to get rid of a tuck box, snack box, pancakes, whatever it might be, and we're going to put a fruit bowl in, of almost just being like a tick box exercise rather than actually making change? Have you noticed that anywhere before? And I guess how have you compensated for that?
Yeah, and I think this is always the struggle. And I guess I would be quite interested in, I guess, from the people in the room, if you or around the table, if you want to kind of put your thoughts in the chat as well, I think that would be really helpful. But I think I have seen it. Some organizations are obviously there and they really are so keen to make an impact because maybe they've noticed that their workforce is drained and they're anxious, and then maybe they're starting to miss work because they're burnt out and they're like skipping lunch, and they can kind of see that there is this real impact on then the overall business goals, like that it can't achieve if its workforce isn't being able to fuel itself. And then on the other side of the scale, there's a lot of kind of potentially could be tick boxing sometimes if people are trying to, maybe their main focus is to achieve a certain award, or they want to get some kind of level of recognition, where it could be that on that to get that stage they have to have spoke to staff about mental well-being and done this, and it might be that yes, those sessions are valuable, and I do think awareness sessions are really valuable. But as we always know, like with changing of habits, it's not normally just one thing. Like some people can just have one session and they'll be like light bulb moment, and then they'll change their breakfast and start having breaks at lunch, and that has a huge impact on them. And I do see that from awareness sessions. But obviously that long-term sustainability of change often needs a little bit of support, which is why I love working with organisations like Notting Hill Genesis, who are really kind of invested in that long-term change. So doing group coaching with their staff and resources.
I was going to ask how you as a manager try and influence that, because that's really hard.
Yeah, definitely. So I often, I'm kind of developing different management training workshops to run with organisations, because what I often find, and it's funny, I delivered a session yesterday. It wasn't actually in housing, it was in an energy kind of company. And it was quite interesting because we were talking a little bit about lunch breaks and who eats at the desk and who doesn't eat at the desk. And what one of the, oh, no worries, Caroline, so you've got to head off, no worries. But one of the main things that was really interesting there was that there was kind of 2 new starters who obviously usually took a lunch break, and they were mentioning to the group when we started the discussion that, oh yeah, we noticed that like a lot of your team sits at your desk at lunchtime, and then we felt quite guilty about leaving for lunch. And I think this often comes up a lot in the housing associations I work with, because staff members might potentially not feel comfortable in taking a break and kind of pause through the day if their managers are always seen to be working through their lunch, working long hours. So it is that kind of, does need to trickle down from the top. So a lot of the things that I'm doing kind of going forward is senior management training around, first of all, educating them, getting them to think a little bit about productivity, about their habits, and then also creating some action plans about how they integrate that with their teams. Is it that their one-to-ones every month has to involve some kind of well-being element? Or is it that they change up their meeting strategy? So maybe once a month, it's kind of a walk and talk where they get out the office, get away from screens. But I definitely agree with you there, Matt, that it has to be that higher level approach. Otherwise, the people on the ground, like, they're not going to be kind of creating these big changes around the culture if their senior management don't seem to be doing the same. So
how does housing kind of compare to other businesses? Because like I said, I know you go fairly broad, but I've done, through your own experience, a lot in housing. How does it compare in terms of a structured environment, in terms of an office-based environment with other businesses? Because I think sometimes in housing there is that thing of 5 o'clock I'm off.
Yeah.
In some teams, but there's still definitely that element of, I mean, I know one business that always used to kind of almost encourage, oh well, if you want a longer lunch break, take it on a Friday, go to your favorite takeaway, whatever it be, McDonald's or whatever fast food it will be, and that's okay on a Friday, just don't do it any other day, because they knew that having that lunch they would then crash out. But because it's a very, everyone looks after each other kind of environment often, that it's an interest. The housing world is just very different to any other, but I didn't know how you see it from a kind of your perspective of going in and coaching.
Yeah, but actually, like, what I'm finding, it's really different inside even just like the housing element. Like, I've had so many different conversations with different housing associations, and it does often strike me how different the culture can be, and maybe people here who've kind of worked in different housing associations might also agree that it's very different depending on where you go, because some organizations, their culture is very much that, yeah, we work our hours, we all take a lunch break, like, and that's the norm, and anything away from that would be strange. Whereas some organizations I sit down and have a chat with is literally the opposite. And what I also find as well is that I'm often surprised when I'm talking to organizations about how much they invest in staff well-being and staff mental health. There is huge differences, and it often doesn't really depend on the size of an organization, because sometimes I might speak with an organization who's got thousands of staff, yet they're still kind of relying on one individual who's also leading HR and or has 1,000 other things to do, and then also gets thrown well-being in with the smallest budget imaginable, and obviously is really keen to support its staff but doesn't have the resources there to do it. So there doesn't seem to be a common theme in terms of I'm seeing more and more kind of well-being leads coming into roles now and having more of budgets set for this and strategies around kind of how they're going to implement a plan. But it really, really varies, which I think is quite interesting.
I think at a time when, we've got the rent cap coming, and I know a lot of places are going to be restructuring, redundancies are going to be made over the next kind of 6 months. Well-being is always one of those areas where people go, right, well, we just can't afford it anymore. So it's really, really great that we can bring something like this to the table today, because it's so vital that if there isn't somebody pushing it, it isn't going to happen, but that everyone can take some form of responsibility for it. And even if it's just having the conversation. In the chat there, well-being and EDI often get thrown onto someone, ironically making them less happy, and can mean picking on the diverse colleagues. So I guess you see that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I see that quite a lot. And then it's so, you can almost see, like, we obviously we've spoken already, but we know burnout is a real issue. And I often really feel for some of these individuals who are kind of thrown the well-being ball on top of their normal role, and you can just see that it's like one extra thing that's on their forever kind of piling up to-do list. And that in itself can cause an issue. The most stressed people I've met are the wellbeing leads. And it's quite interesting from an outsider coming in as well. For me, it's almost quite nice. And I noticed that a lot of the wellbeing leads quite like that I'm coming in as an outsider, because they often find that because they're that lead within the organization, and we know that people often struggle to engage with wellbeing things, they often feel like they are ignored now. When they send an email, their messages are the ones that get instantly deleted, or they're seen as the kind of, oh, the preachy one, here we go again. Like, so actually it's quite nice for them when I come in as an outsider with a different voice and a different perception of how to do things. It can be quite nice for that individual, and can look to engage different people who maybe might have switched off from that, like, one person.
Claire, were you going to come in there?
I was just going to say that's really interesting, the similarity there, that I have the same with data protection, which is my specialty. The data protection officer gets ignored, and they quite often need to say, look, Claire says it as well, you've got to get this outsider person to say, yes, that's right, and then they'll listen to me just because I'm an outsider.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Like, how the human brain works. But I think we often find it though, don't we? You've got to see different information a certain amount of times before it starts going into that kind of unconscious part of your brain. So often it can really help to have a variety of people. And I think a lot of housing organisations now that I'm working with are recognising this to an extent, and they are creating more of a wellbeing team. And again, it's not that that's really a huge amount of their role. They've still got to be the housing officer, or they've still got to be finance lead, or whatever it is, but they're kind of having these wellbeing leads from different teams so that hopefully they can shimmy up the role. But then I guess the issues with that comes then that who drives the team and who's that kind of person, that lead. And if we think about like organizations and communities are struggling so much now with income, and budgets are tighter probably than ever before, we do actually now have to start really kind of educating the budget leads, and also maybe the boards and things like that, about the return of investment of some of these initiatives. Because on a piece of paper, it might be that, oh yeah, why would we bother running something about nutrition or about maybe eating well on a budget? That's not going to protect, it's not going to help me, quote unquote, as that kind of trying to get my targets in housing. But actually, when we start educating about the return of investment, about how the workforce is then going to be more productive, they're going to have more energy to kind of get their targets, they're going to be more resilient to stress because they're fueling themselves well, their blood sugar levels are balanced. So actually, they're going to be better in the communities, in these high stressful environments. These kind of teams often struggle to communicate maybe some of these return of investments because it's not their specialism. They're just there trying to rally up the troops, which is important. But sometimes it needs that potentially external person to come in and kind of share some of that key information.
It's bizarre. We sometimes see outsiders as specialists, even though we've hired them ourselves. But that's, well, I suppose sometimes with well-being especially, though, there is that element of you can go on a course or whatever it might be, but you know, you've dedicated your career to this, whereas someone's taking this on as a matter of being a lead rather than a specialist. Again, that comes down to, you know, we've talked about restructuring and things like that, how much money you can put into those. So I certainly hope more people kind of come to you and understand the importance of a lot of this. I'm aware we've got kind of 10 minutes or so left. There was another topic I wanted and kind of wanted to bring up today, because evidently housing is so varied and is, you know, many facets. And I know there are people in this room who support people in a number of different ways externally as part of their housing providers. So what responsibility, I guess, do you feel housing associations, be that through officers, be that through operatives, whatever it might be, to have in kind of coaching their tenants on well-being, healthy eating, and the relationship really between that gut and mental health? Because we're going into a time of, you know, more austerity for the poor, you know, and actually not even for the poor, which is an awful term, but for everybody at the moment, it's going to be a really difficult winter. Often healthy foods can be more expensive than your cheap foods, which in itself is a problem.
Yeah.
So how, A, is there a responsibility that housing associations have their tenants on teaching this? And B, if there is, what message needs to get out there?
Yeah, definitely. And again, I'd be quite interested to hear what other people think around this topic, because this is something that obviously I'm going to be biased, because I 100% think that housing associations should be responsible. And actually a lot of that, I am kind of creating another arm of my business now that is actually working with construction firms as putting nutrition and some of the projects that I run as part of their social responsibility bids, so that when actually they are creating new builds, they are actually then within the communities around. But I think if we think about it logically, it's kind of a leveled approach. If we think about our tenants, if they are really struggling with poor mental health, they potentially can't work, then that's then has a knock-on effect of, right, are they being able to kind of pay their rent, which obviously goes back to the main business cause of housing associations, to be able to create an income through rent. So I believe that it is a responsibility, not purely on housing. Obviously, there's a lot of players within the community, and I also agree that individuals should take that kind of leading role in their own well-being. But I think as housing associations are within the communities already, there's the housing officers, there's the neighbourhood managers, they're and again, it depends on organisation and kind of areas, but quite often these are the people who are in the community, they're trusted, they speak with their tenants, they know the local community groups, and they are such a valuable asset. And I know they've got a variety of different roles that they have to fulfill. But if it could be that some of these messages that they learn on the awareness sessions, or they have tools or resources even just to hand out, and they can start to educate the community about eating well on a budget, or even as simply as if some families are going to food banks, actually, how do they prepare some of these foods? Because there might be huge barriers of people who are really, really struggling, and they're maybe getting a vegetable from the food bank and they literally just don't know how to prepare it or what to do with it. But so, yeah, it's really difficult, but I do think there is a kind of a priority there. And Rosie, were you keen to, have you got a point?
Yeah, so Rosie was actually on with on a previous roundtable, has done a lot of work with young people and children's homes and care leaves and things like that. So as you just made a point there in the chat, there's a lot of real link between comfort foods and people who've experienced trauma, Rosie.
Yeah, so apologies, I'm in my car with my kids asleep behind me in Tesco's car park. So just about to go do my shopping. So really sort of perfect timing. But yeah, so this is something we've experienced in children's homes. And when our young people first come into the homes, we have this culture, and this is actually down to training that we've had. It's direct training, where we've been taught that there's a link between young people who've experienced trauma and providing them with comfort foods. And we've always been encouraged to do that. But what we find is that there's a whole kind of thing here, and I'd love to kind of pick this up in more detail with you. But young people who come into our children's homes often have come from families where they haven't learned about food, nutrition, they haven't learned how to cook. And the kind of the standard food is your frozen bits, your beige food, etc., etc. We had these young people with us for a very short amount of time, and one of the things that we find is a lot of our young people are either overweight or very underweight, or very, malnourished actually. And often we don't get to a point by the end of working with them where there's been really any improvement around diet at all. Because as a culture, we just kind of say, let's give them, we're trained to give them the pizza, give them the cake, give them the biscuits. And I think that is a really, really, really big challenge. And so my other sort of point that I was just about to type as well is, when we think about the future of housing, in my mind, this kind of future of housing, community housing, to me would be a model where we have not just houses, but we have a community hub, and we have a garden, and people are involved in growing food, know where their food comes from. People help do cooking, help teach each other, because a lot of the older generations actually have a much better understanding of cooking and budgeting and actually having a balanced diet, whereas some of the the younger ones haven't learned that, particularly the ones that have been through care. So I've got this lovely image in my mind, but, I guess it's not really a question, but so much more of a comment. Yeah. But also, how do we teach young people to eat healthy, but also, do you think there is a link between comfort food and trauma, or do you think that that's just a load of nonsense and actually we should be teaching young people to eat healthy from day one?
Yeah, it's such an interesting point, Rosie, and also the fact that training's there. It's really, really interesting. So we do actually know that comfort foods, like your more carbohydrate rich foods, it releases dopamine, which is why if we're not feeling good or we're unhappy, we tend to crave a cake rather than a carrot. Like it's that kind of, it gives us that comfort. So a part of me totally and this is the thing, I think people should be able to get comfort from food, and a part of me is thinking, oh my goodness, these children who've been through so much, yes, let's dopamine them up, let's kind of give them things that will kind of support them. But at the same time, it kind of makes me think, oh my goodness, this is like, I'm kind of Jekyll and Hyde a little bit, because I'm also now thinking about the huge links we know around our gut environment and things like ADHD, and how actually some of these highly processed foods that maybe children are having all the time, how that actually can impact behavior, and how that can then have a knock-on effects of their education and how they present themselves to the world. So I totally get that it's not going to be a click of the fingers and change habit, but I recognize that, yes, there is a priority of creating comfort, but also I think, especially in people like children going into care, I feel like it's a duty of care to also then be those role models and start introducing some of these principles around education, so that they have the same opportunities as maybe a more privileged family who maybe might have more education around fully nourishing, or maybe learn a little bit more about cooking. So yeah, I totally get that I feel like that needs to be introduced. But I really love your idea about the community hubs and the community gardens, and I know some housing associations are on the same wavelength as you, and really love the idea of that. And I know in some kind of new builds that is always a consideration about how do we bring communities together, because that's often lost nowadays, isn't it, in housing, that kind of community feel where we learn from older generations.
I'm actually on the board for Spring Housing. We had our first meeting this week, and their homeless hostel, they've done that. So the homeless hostel, which is all temporary accommodation, there's a place up back, and it's brought, because a lot of them are refugees as well. It's really built a community around healthy eating and gardening, and they held an evening to say thank you to everyone who helped put it together, and all the food was stuff they'd grown, and the sense of pride that came through that. But it was also far healthier, and you noticed a lift. And it's only now I'm kind of thinking about the case of, well, yeah, probably because there wasn't anything processed in there. There wasn't anything that was bad for your gut, and there wasn't anything in there that was having a negative effect. And evidently that's where, you know, and the sharing of knowledge between communities is absolutely vital in all of this, isn't it, Laura?
100%. And I think there's a point there as well. Like when I used to work in housing, delivering in the communities, we often had very obviously children coming who had a very processed diet, wouldn't eat a tomato or anything like that. And it was incredible that when we started doing cooking sessions with them, and when they were involved with preparing the food, their parent, like, I'd sometimes be like, it would be quite frustrating, but the parents would be like, oh, they won't eat that. And then the child would like eat a little bit, they'd eat a tomato or have a bit of the like pita pizza, and the parents would be like completely overwhelmed by it, because they would never ever eat anything like that at home. So yeah, kind of getting people involved in that growing and cooking, can be really, really valuable.
And where we've reached 12 o'clock, and we could keep going for ages with this, it's a fascinating topic, and one that I really hope kind of gets more traction, particularly in housing, where there are unfortunately still quite a lot of archaic practices, and people do still, I think, have a lot to learn. There are a lot of conversations that need to be had. For yourself, Laura, what would be your kind of key takeaway? What's the thing that people need to be doing now to just get started on the journey?
I think it's just about creating conversations initially. I think the conversations that maybe even just passing on a bit of knowledge around, oh, have you heard much about this gut health and like how that impacts your mental health? Because the majority of people I speak to are totally clueless about it, and it's because it is very new science. So I think if we can start creating conversations and start allowing people to think about, oh, actually the food I'm eating is impacting my health. And I think it's reassuring in the fact that it's something that we can control. Often people with mental health issues, they feel like they have to rely on therapists or medication. And yes, those things can be absolutely amazing and pivotal, but there's something quite nice about knowing that your food choices can also have an impact. So I think conversations are always good to start with.
I know Jordan's had to shoot. Thank you so much for today, Laura. Thank you for bringing this to the table. I'm going to get this up on, get the recording up so other people can kind of watch it back. How do people get in touch with you if they want to take this further?
Yep, so either find me on LinkedIn, so just Laura Bryan, Mind Nourishing, or my website, mindnourishing.com is probably a good place to go.
Thank you so much for bringing this to the table today. As always, these are run every single Tuesday, 11 till 12. I'm just flicking through because I'm having a complete mind blank. I ate the wrong thing this morning. In terms of what we're talking about next week, and I actually think it ties in quite nicely with this one to an extent. It's how we bring more cultural diversity to frontline teams. And I think often anything to do with food does bring diversity to within it. So hopefully it should be another good session. But for now, Laura, thank you so much for today. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I will see you all soon. Take care.
Thank you.